be my sea training which has instilled in me the obligation and the desire to serve well, and I have carried my notion of good service from my earlier into my later existence, from the decks of ships to the most circumscribed space of my desk. The ocean has the conscienceless temper of a savage autocrat spoiled by much adulation. From that day he has gone on swallowing up fleets and men without his resentment being glutted by the number of victims, by so many wrecked ships and wrecked lives. If not always in the hot mood to smash, he is always stealthily ready for a drowning. The most amazing wonder of the deep is its unfathomable cruelty. Already I looked with other eyes upon the sea. My conception of its magnanimous greatness was gone. And I looked upon the true sea, the sea that plays with men till their hearts are broken, and wears stout ships to death. The sea is strong medicine. Behold what the quarterdeck training, even in a merchant ship, will do. For this insignificant lad, hailing from a remote province in a faraway land known as Poland, managed to earn, to his great credit, a captain's license in the British merchant service.
When these events unfolded, that remote province in a faraway land wasn't even called Poland, the old kingdom having been carved up in 1791. Conrad was born, as he would later write, in the oppressive shadow of the great Russian Empire, at Berdichov in Ukraine, a town populated by Unyats, Jews, Russian Orthodox, and a smattering of Catholic Poles. His father, Apollo Korzenowski, hailed from a nobility endowed with wits rather than riches, and was obliged to manage agricultural estates. He did so with neither great conviction nor success. He spent most of his time writing patriotic poems in the company of nationalists, dreaming of freedom and hatching conspiracies against their czarist oppressors. In 1861, Apollo returned to Warsaw to run an independent newspaper and be closer to the underground movement. The oppressive shadow of the Russian Empire was growing ever darker. One peaceful demonstration turned into a bloodbath at the hands of the Cossacks and led to Conrad Korzenowski's father being imprisoned in the Warsaw citadel. He remained incarcerated for 6 months, using his time there to work on translations of Dickens, Hugo, and Shakespeare. The young Conrad went to see him and was to remember the visit all his life.
It was in the bleak surroundings of the Warsaw citadel that my conscious life really began.
When he was 6, he scribbled on the back of his first photograph,
"For my dear grandmother, who helped me supply cake to my poor father in prison, from her grandson, a Pole, a Catholic, and a gentleman, Conrad."
After prison came exile. Apollo and his family were banished to Vologda, a cold and inhospitable region in the north of Russia. For Conrad's mother, already seriously ill, the cold, hunger, and lack of care were hard to endure. The brave support she had given to her husband's activities meant she was neither spared nor indulged. Apollo and his son could only watch helplessly as tuberculosis, deprivation, and despair took its toll. She died in April 1865. Conrad was 11 years old. The health of Apollo was also deteriorating rapidly, so much so that he was granted permission to return from exile to live first in Lvov, then Krakow. It was here, at the heart of Polish culture, that Conrad was introduced to the writings of Mickiewicz and Słowacki, romantic authors and spokesmen for the Polish nation and its values. The young Korzenowski devoured books, tackling Shakespeare, discovering Hugo's Toilers of the Sea, and mapping out his destiny, a fascination with England and the ocean. At the Palace of Wawel in the shadow of Copernic, an illustrious fellow Pole, he loved to pore over astronomical charts and maps of the world. As he leafed through old atlases, he invented for himself a destiny of discovery and conquest, escaping his dull and tragic existence and blanking out the vision of his demoralized father, by now a broken man for whom death was drawing ever closer.
It was in 1868, when 9 years old or thereabouts, that while looking at a map of Africa of the time and putting my finger on the blank space then representing the unsolved mystery of that continent, I said to myself with absolute assurance and an amazing audacity, which are no longer in my character now, when I grow up, I shall go there. And of course I thought no more about it till after a quarter of a century or so an opportunity offered to go there. Yes, I did go there. There being the region of Stanley Falls, which in 1868 was the blankest of blank spaces on the Earth's figured surface.
"22 years were to elapse between the scrawny infant uttering those words and Captain Conrad Korzinowski's African adventure up the Congo aboard the steamer Le Roi des Belges. It would be a further 10 years before the impressions gathered during the months spent on board ship, the crepuscular visions, the sounds of wild nature and the rage of men, were to manifest themselves in one of Joseph Conrad's best-known novels.
We penetrated deeper and deeper into the heart of darkness. It was very quiet there. At night, sometimes the roll of drums behind the curtain of trees would run up the river and remain sustained faintly, as if hovering in the air high over our heads till the first break of day. Whether it meant war, peace, or prayer, we could not tell. We were wanderers on a prehistoric Earth, on an Earth that wore the aspect of an unknown planet. The steamer toiled along slowly on the edge of a black and incomprehensible frenzy. The prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? We were cut off from the comprehension of our surroundings.
Conscientious sailor that he was, Conrad kept a meticulous log, but these very first writings in still hesitant English, interspersed with whole pages of French, reveal more than just the dangers that lurked in the great river. They hint at the characteristic traits of Conrad, the man and the moralist. His innate chivalry led him to believe, naively perhaps, that an offer received from a Belgian company, the Société Anonyme pour le Commerce du Haut-Congo, would entail an exploratory mission to civilize, a crusade to bring progress and Western enlightenment to the dark continent. The gradual realization of the white man's exploitation of natives and nature triggered Conrad's slow but inexorable disillusionment. Many years later, his pen would ooze venom in describing the folly of the merchant's veracity.
Ivory? I should think so. Heaps of it, stacks of it. The old mud shanty was bursting with it. You would think there was not a single tusk left either above or below the ground in the whole country. We filled the steamboat with it and had to pile a lot on the deck. Thus he could see and enjoy as long as he could see, because the appreciation of this favor had remained with him to the last. You should have heard him say, "My ivory." Oh yes, I heard him. My intended, my ivory, my station, my river, my... everything belonged to him.
Having lost his health and his illusions, Conrad came within a whisker of losing his life too. When warned of the dreadful living conditions in the Congo, the gentleman Pole exclaimed,
"I am a Polish gentleman coated in British tar. Well, if that be my fate." Destiny. My destiny. Droll thing life is, that mysterious arrangement of merciless logic for a futile purpose. The most you can hope from it is some knowledge of yourself that comes too late, a crop of unextinguishable regrets. I have wrestled with death. It is the most unexciting contest you can imagine. I was within a hair's breadth of the last opportunity for pronouncement, and I found with humiliation that probably I would have nothing to say. This is the reason why I affirm that Kurtz was a remarkable man. He had something to say. He had summed up. He had judged the horror.
At the beginning of 1891, Captain Conrad, stricken with dysentery, returned to London. 25 years had elapsed since the young Conrad Korzenowski had been in Poland dreaming of Africa. After the death of his father Apollo, he was entrusted to his uncle Tadeusz Bobrowski, who strove to give him a decent education. But the young man continued to dream of distant sunny horizons far from the snow-covered homeland, which held for him only sad memories and the promise of a gloomy future as the son of an outlaw. He wanted to be a sailor, and his persistence eventually won the reluctant support of his uncle and guardian. In 1874, at the age of 17, Conrad headed for the sea. He arrived in Marseille with a few letters of recommendation, a little money, and a reasonable knowledge of French. His 4 years spent along the Mediterranean coastline would later provide material for tales of adventure, beautiful women, and gun running. It's very tempting to make a direct comparison between the incidents he describes and events in his own life. Which, if any of them, actually occurred? And does it matter? Once written down, it all becomes real.
This, his first great adventure, as he calls it, begins in Marseille. It ends there, too. It's the story of a young gentleman who had arrived furnished with proper credentials and who apparently was doing his best to waste his life in an eccentric fashion, with a bohemian set on one side and on the other making friends with the people of the old town, pilots, coasters, sailors, workers of all sorts. He pretended, rather absurdly, to be a seaman himself, and was already credited with an ill-defined and vaguely illegal enterprise in the Gulf of Mexico.
Having acquired a rudimentary knowledge of the sailor's profession, Conrad took to sea, as a passenger, aboard the Mont Blanc, a sailboat bound for Martinique. Lacking the seafaring experience required to get himself hired as a crew member, most likely Conrad opted to force his destiny. He wanted to see for himself at close quarters just what life on the open sea entailed. He'd succeeded in escaping a landlocked world and in winning over his mentor. Barely out of childhood, he was living like a man. He could no longer wait.
Only the young have such moments. I don't mean the very young. No, the very young have, properly speaking, no moments. It is the privilege of early youth to live in advance of its days in all the beautiful continuity of hope which knows no pauses and no introspection. One closes behind one the little gate of mere boyishness and enters an enchanted garden. Its very shades glow with promise. Every turn of the path has its seduction, and it isn't because it is an undiscovered country. One knows well enough that all mankind had streamed that way. One goes on recognizing the landmarks of the predecessors, excited, amused, taking the hard luck and the good luck together, the kicks and the halfpence, as the saying is, the picturesque common lot that holds so many possibilities for the deserving, or perhaps for the lucky. Yes, one goes on, and the time too goes on, till one perceives ahead a shadow line warning one that the region of early youth too must be left behind.
Young Conrad's audacity paid off. When the Mont Blanc returned to Marseille, he went straight back to sea, this time as a sailor. Once more he was bound for the West Indies, calling in at Haiti and the Virgin Islands, with a stopover in Martinique. The full significance of this short voyage, a mere excursion, would not be seen till much later, when the by then celebrated author set about writing his most difficult and complex novel, Nostromo. These few hundred pages represent a colossal work of the imagination. Harnessing a few fleeting memories, the author manages to conjure from nothing Costaguana, a South American republic more real than life, complete with its own history, geography, civil wars, and eccentric characters. But the strain of his invention tortured Conrad, who many years later was to confide,
"This damn Nostromo business will be the death of me. All my memories of Central America seem to have evaporated. A fleeting visit 25 years ago, over in the winking of an eye. Hardly enough to build a whole novel on. Still, one has to make a living."
On his return to Marseille in 1877, Conrad was just 20. There then followed a rather shady period of his life, one littered with mysterious occupations and activities. Although later in life he was to amuse himself by offering contradictory versions of events from that time, his involvements in arms smuggling for the Carlistes has been pretty well established. What we do know is that in February 1878, his uncle received a telegram in Kiev which read, "Conrad injured, send money." Had he really been involved in a duel, as Conrad himself claimed? Or was it a suicide attempt provoked by heavy losses sustained at the casino, or the problems he was experiencing obtaining the documentation required to go back to sea? Whatever it was, from that moment on, Conrad, who had always asserted that if I am to be a sailor, then I must be a British sailor, he applied himself to securing an enlistment in the British Merchant Navy, a fact attested to by the recommendation countersigned by His Majesty's Consul in Marseille. The still Polish sailor got himself hired aboard the English ship Mavis, and in 1878 discovered for the first time the port of London.
The stony shores ran away right and left in straight lines, enclosing a somber and rectangular pool. Brick walls rose high above the water, soulless walls staring through hundreds of windows as troubled and dull as the eyes of overfed brutes. At their base, monstrous iron cranes crouched, with chains hanging from their long necks, balancing cruel-looking hooks over the decks of lifeless ships. A noise of wheels rolling over stones, the thump of heavy things falling, the racket of feverish winches, the grinding of strained chains floated on the air. Between high buildings, the dust of all the continents soared in short flights, and a penetrating smell of perfumes and dirt, of spices and hides, of things costly and of things filthy, pervaded the space, made for it an atmosphere precious and disgusting. The Narcissus came gently into her berth. The shadows of soulless walls fell upon her. The dust of all the continents leaped upon her deck, and a swarm of strange men clambering up her sides took possession of her in the name of the sordid earth. She had ceased to live.
Navigating through black fumes of smoke, covered in soot, surrounded by men whose language he could barely understand, this was hardly a great incentive for the young Conrad to go straight back to sea. He hung around the port of London, spending all his money and attempting once again to secure an advance on the allowance sent to him regularly by his uncle Thaddeus. Here's the reply.
My good Conrad, I have no objection to your serving on a British ship, but returning to England and spending all my money in London is out of the question. Do something, anything, work, study, but don't start playing the rich gentleman. If you have not secured for yourself a job by the time you are 24, I shall cut you off. I have no money for layabouts, and I refuse to work to fund someone else's high living.
3 months later, Conrad went back to sea as an ordinary seaman aboard the Duke of Sutherland, a splendid wool clipper bound for Australia. The 900-day voyage would be blighted by headwinds and a storm in the Indian Ocean. It was on this run that Conrad was to discover the sea's cruelty and the dreadful harshness of life on board ship. After a 12-hour stint in the masts and on deck, the drenched and frozen sailors would go below to consume often foul food, before squeezing into narrow sleeping berths and a complete lack of privacy. Here's what Conrad had to say about it.
I may safely say that through the blind force of circumstances, the sea was to be all my world, and the merchant service my only home for a long succession of years. No wonder, then, that I have tried with an almost filial regard to pay my tribute to the sea, its ships, and its men, to whom I remain indebted for so much which has gone to make me what I am.
In the merchant navy, he found the home his native Poland had failed to be. It's a clear and often harsh verdict delivered by a man who, by the age of 30, was to claim,
when I speak, think, or write in English, the word home to me always means the hospitable shores of the British Isles.
After 2 years of sailing under a British flag, Conrad was promoted to second mate and secured a commission aboard the Palestine, a suitably dilapidated three-masted, which was to be renamed the Judea in his story Youth, published some 20 years later.
This could have occurred nowhere but in England, where men and sea interpenetrate, so to speak, the sea entering into the life of most men. It was altogether a memorable affair. It was my first voyage to the East, and my first voyage as second mate. It was also my skipper's first command. You'll admit it was time. He was 60, if a day. The ship also was old. Her name was the Judea. Below her name, in big letters, a lot of scroll work with the gilt off and some sort of a coat of arms with the motto, "Do or die," underneath. I remember it took my fancy immensely. We were a week working up as far as Yarmouth Roads, and then we got into a gale, the famous October gale of 22 years ago. It was wind, lightning, sleet, snow, and a terrific sea. We were flying light, and you may imagine how bad it was when I tell you we had smashed bulwarks and a flooded deck. And there was somewhere in me the thought, by Jove, this is the deuce of an adventure, something you read about. And it is my first voyage as second mate, and I am only 20, and here I am lasting it out as well as any of these men, and keeping my chaps up to the mark. I was pleased. I would not have given up the experience for worlds. I had moments of exultation. Whenever the old dismantled craft pitched heavily with her counter high in the air, she seemed to me to throw up like an appeal, like a defiance, like a cry to the clouds without mercy, the words written on her stern, "Judea, London, do or die." To me, she was not an old rattletrap carting about the world a lot of coal for a freight. To me, she was the endeavor, the test, the trial of life.
Unfortunately, despite the tenacity of its captain, this trial of life was to fall victim to breakdowns and problems, exacerbated by incredible bad luck. Having already suffered a collision in port, the badly repaired vessel soon began to break up beneath the crew's feet, shipping water everywhere. Then the cargo of coal caught fire. Having pumped water out of the ship, the sailors now had to frantically pump water back on board to extinguish the flames. Despite the men's best efforts, the fires spread and the cargo eventually exploded. Marlowe, the narrator and hero of youth, a character in whom Conrad invested much of himself, was now for the first time captain, in charge of 2 men in a lifeboat.
I need not tell you what it is to be knocking about in an open boat. I remember nights and days of calm when we pulled and we pulled. I remember the drawn faces, the dejected figures of my men, and I remember my youth and the feeling that will never come back anymore. The feeling that I could last forever, outlast the sea, the earth, and all men. We drag at the oars with aching arms, and suddenly a puff of wind, a puff faint and tepid and laden with strange odors of blossoms, of aromatic wood, comes out of the still night, the first sigh of the east on my face. And then I saw the men of the east. They were looking at me. The whole length of the jetty was full of people. I saw brown, bronze, yellow faces, the black eyes, the glitter, the color of an eastern crowd. And all these beings stared without a murmur, without a sigh, without a movement. They stared down at the boats, at the sleeping men who at night had come to them from the sea, sleeping unconscious of the land and the people and of the violence of sunshine. They slept thrown across the thwarts, curled on bottom boards in the careless attitudes of death. The east looked at them without a sound. I have known its fascination since. I have seen the mysterious shores, the still water, the lands of brown nations, where a stealthy nemesis lies in wait, pursues, overtakes so many of the conquering race who are proud of their wisdom, of their knowledge, of their strength. But for me, all the East is contained in that vision of my youth. It is all in that moment when I opened my young eyes on it. I came upon it from a tussle with the sea, and I was young, and I saw it looking at me. And this is all that is left of it. Only a moment of strength, of romance, of glamour, of youth.
On returning to London, Conrad went back to sea as second mate aboard the sailboat Riversdale, heading for the Cape and then Madras in the Indies. With each ship came a new destination: Bombay, Singapore, Calcutta, always as second mate on the 3-masted Tilkhurst. In 1886, Conrad first became a British national. Then, in the supreme recognition of his efforts, a fully licensed captain. Did he pass the exam brilliantly at the first attempt, as he claimed in his book, A Personal Record? Or did he scrape through after 2 failures, a version of events supported by several documents? As is often the case elsewhere, even in autobiographical works by Conrad himself, the writer appears to have succumbed to temptation in presenting a personal version of reality, more in keeping with his vision and artistic license. Can we blame him?
I am not a writer of history. I write stories. Hence, I am entitled to choose as I see fit what will occur as regards the characters and details of the tale, and to create the overall impression that I am striving to convey.
However, having a captain's certificate does not guarantee a command. Hence, Conrad went back to sea under Captain McWeir, the inspiration for one of his most powerful seafaring characters, the incredible skipper of the Nanshan in Typhoon. The story provides a brilliant description, probably the best ever written, of a storm. But it is, of course, much, much more than that.
I never met anybody personally concerned in this affair, the interest of which for us was, of course, not the bad weather, but the extraordinary complication brought into the ship's life at a moment of exceptional stress by the human element, the dozens of coolies below her deck.
Conrad was hurt by suggestions that he only wrote about the sea. He refuted the charges.
Actually, I have written very little about the sea if one bothers to count the pages. And when I launched my first ships on paper in the infancy of my literary career, I was intending an element as dangerous and changing as the sea itself, and even vaster, the uncalmable ocean of human life.
Nevertheless, Conrad's work is inextricably linked to the sea. What's more, this former sailor, who by his own account wrote line by line rather than page by page, had to summon up all the endurance, obstinacy, and courage acquired during his seafaring years in his writing career.
I had, like the prophet of old, wrestled with the Lord for my creation. It is difficult to characterize otherwise the intimacy and the strain of a creative effort in which mind, will, and conscience are engaged to the full, hour after hour, day after day, away from the world and to the exclusion of all that makes life really lovable and gentle. Something for which a material parallel can only be found in the everlasting somber stress of the westward winter passage round Cape Horn. For that, too, is the wrestling of men with the might of their Creator, in a great isolation from the world, without the amenities and consolations of life, a lonely struggle under a sense of overmatched littleness for no reward that could be adequate, but for the mere winning of a longitude.
In 1893, Captain Korjanowski sailed, again as second mate, on board the Torrance, a magnificent clipper serving the London to Australia line. For some time now, he'd been devoting his free time on board to writing a manuscript. He'd started it 4 years earlier for no other reason than to occupy himself in the mornings whilst awaiting an embarkation. Although outwardly, Conrad still looked like a man capable of commanding a ship, his mind would henceforth be haunted by the quest for the word that will capture his visions. The Torrance, reputed for its speed and comfort, also took passengers on board. Conrad forged a friendship with one of them, a Cambridge student by the name of John Galsworthy, who expressed an interest in reading the second mate's prose. The enthusiastic response of this first reader must have contributed in no small way to the sailor's decision to pursue a writing career and finish his first novel. It was titled Almayer Folly, a story of an eastern river.
Ah, the river. His old friend and his old enemy, speaking always with the same voice as he runs from year to year, bringing fortune or disappointment, happiness or pain, upon the same varying but unchanged surface of glancing currents and swirling eddies. For many years he had listened to the passionless and soothing murmur that sometimes was the song of hope, at times the song of triumph, of encouragement, more often the whisper of consolation that spoke of better days to come. For so many years.
Almayer's Folly is not just the story of a river, far from it. The novel is actually made up of several interrelating stories. First, there's Almayer himself. Conrad gives a chilling account of the decline of a white man seeking fortune at a trading post in Borneo, overwhelmed by bad luck and ruined by the competition and cunning of Malaysian and Chinese merchants. It's also the tale of his crushing disappointment at losing his daughter Nina, who's torn between the cultures and mores of her father and those of her Malaysian mother.
To her resolute nature, however, after all these years, the savage and uncompromising sincerity of purpose shown by her Malay kinsman seemed at last preferable to the sleek hypocrisy, to the polite disguises, to the virtuous pretenses of such white people as she had had the misfortune to come into contact with. After all, it was her life, it was going to be her life, and so thinking, she fell more and more under the influence of her mother. Seeking in her ignorance a better side to that life, she listened with avidity to the old woman's tales of the departed glories of the Rajas from whose race she had sprung, and she became gradually more indifferent, more contemptuous of the white side of her descent, represented by a feeble and traditionless father.
It's also a passionate love story of Nina and Dain, a warrior and man of the sea.
I mean to follow him. I have been rejected with scorn by the white people, and now I am a Malay. He took me in his arms. He laid his life at my feet. He is brave. He will be powerful, and I hold his bravery and his strength in my hand, and I shall make him great.
Nina refuses to leave Dain, who's being pursued by the Dutch army, and Almayer looks out with horror at the approaching prowl, come to take away his daughter forever.
He brought his foot down with the stamp. He was a firm man, firm as a rock. Let her go. He never had a daughter. He would forget. Forget, muttered Almayer. He had a fixed idea that if he should not forget before he died, he would have to remember for all eternity. For a long time he stood in deep thought, lost in the alarming possibilities of unconquerable memory, with the fear of death and eternity before him.
Between 1880 and 1890, when he wasn't in service at sea, Conrad spent many months in the Far East, either awaiting an embarkation or seeking a ship's command. He lived around the ports, meeting sailors, agents, ship owners, and talking to captains. There he would hear many strange stories and read the local newspapers with their reports of various adventures at sea. Hence, when he began to write, it was only natural that he draw heavily on his prodigious memory. A veritable treasure trove of situations, people, landscapes, feelings, and emotions, in writing his first novels set in Malaysia. Besides, what else did a roving seaman in exile have to offer his blasé English-speaking readers? This exoticism, added to the power of his words, helped Conrad win over the public and critics alike when his other Malaysian novels were published.
The woman tossed her head slightly back. She stood straight, slim, expectant, with a readiness to dart away suggested in the light immobility of her pose. Through the mesh of scattered hair, her face looked like the face of a golden statue with living eyes. The heavy eyelids dropped slightly, and from between the long eyelashes, she sent out a sidelong look, hard, keen, and narrow, like the gleam of sharp steel. Then she smiled. In the somber beauty of her face, that smile was like the first ray of light on a stormy daybreak that darts evanescent and pale through the gloomy clouds, the forerunner of sunrise and of thunder.
Everyone will wind up on a steamship. Conrad had one of his characters remark. It was on board a steamship that his own seafaring career would end. The Adova had come to Rouen to collect French immigrants bound for Canada, but the ship lay idle there for 2 months, waiting for passengers who would never come. On returning to London in January 1894, Conrad was to put down his kit bag for the very last time. His seafaring days were over. The writer in him would now emerge. He'd already garnered enough material for an entire book. All he had to do now was write it down. Having long since realized his ambition to become a British captain, he now wanted to be an English writer. Irritated at being saddled with the countless variations his new compatriots offered of the name Korsianovsky, he decided to call himself Joseph Conrad. In 1896, at the age of 39, he met and married Jessie George, who was just 22 years old. They lived first in Essex and later in Kent, where a few years later, their 2 sons, Boris and John, were born. Their homes lay deep in the verdant countryside, far from the salons and bustle of London. Conrad required absolute tranquility to set about his work, to find the right word. Although he now lived far from the sea, it was never far away in his books. Nigger of the Narcissus, The Lagoon, End of the Tether, The Mirror of the Sea. The Jewel, Prince Roman, and many others demonstrated that Conrad was prepared to venture onto dry land in his storytelling. The Secret Agent and Under Western Eyes reflected his interest in the political movements, particularly anarchist ones, that would prefigure the upheavals of the 20th century.
Then the vision of an enormous town presented itself, of a monstrous town more populous than some continents, and in its man-made might, as if indifferent to heaven's frowns and smiles, a cruel devourer of the world's light. There was room enough there to place any story, depth enough for any passion, variety enough there for any setting, darkness enough to bury 5 millions of lives.
Despite his growing fame, Conrad worked for many years under pressure from editors and with a chronic lack of resources. On the eve of the First World War, Conrad took his family back to Warsaw to be reunited with relatives, friends, and numerous admirers, not to mention a few jealous compatriots. Now a British citizen, he only just managed to escape and return to England when war was declared during his visit. He made it a point of honor to serve in the Royal Navy for a brief and symbolic mission on board HMS Ready. In 1923, he accepted an invitation to visit the United States, where he was even more popular than in England. He was welcomed as a star. Victory, a movie directed by Maurice Tourneur, was the first Hollywood adaptation of his work and the only film to be released during his lifetime. Dozens of other films were to follow, between 1923's Lord Jim and Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, a liberal adaptation based on Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Yet aside from the obviously simplified settings and situations, what has the cinema managed to capture of Conrad's writing, his language, and his style? Maybe the storyteller has not always been well served by the movie industry. At the end of his stay in America, Conrad gave a noteworthy lecture before an enthusiastic audience, surprised by the strong accent of a man who, despite being a foreigner, had managed to greatly enrich the English language and its literature.
The fact I do not write in my mother tongue has sometimes led me to be regarded as something of a phenomenon. In truth, my ability to write in English is as natural to me as any other aptitude which I may have been blessed with at birth. English has been for me neither a matter of choice nor of adoption. The very concept of choice never occurred to me. As for adoption, well, yes, there was an adoption, but it was I who was adopted by the genius of the language. Ultimately, all that I ask after so many years spent using this language with love and with a heart that doubt, imperfection, and hesitation have filled with anguish, is to be believed when I say that had I not written in English, I would not have written at all. Ah, the good old time. The good old time. Youth and the sea, glamour and the sea. By all that's wonderful, it is the sea, I believe, the sea itself. Or is it youth alone? Who can tell? But you here, you all had something out of life, money, love, whatever one gets on shore. And tell me, Wasn't that the best time? That time when we were young at sea, young and had nothing, on the sea that gives nothing except hard knocks, and sometimes a chance to feel your strength. That only, what you all regret.